Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Today we're going to continue our journey with Bertie and Elizabeth after the marriage of their precious daughter, Princess Elizabeth. 5 months after Princess Elizabeth got married, her parents celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. They went to St. Paul's Cathedral on April the 26th, 1948. It was a service of thanksgiving. The crowds were out to cheer them during their 2-mile procession from the palace, and Princess Margaret was there with her parents. There was a congregation of 4,000, and it was broadcast on the radio. George VI and Elizabeth sat on velvet chairs under the great dome, and when the service started, they knelt in prayer. The bells rang, trumpets sounded, and the organ played. The choir sang, "I Was Glad." The end of the service, Handel's Zadok, the priest, was played. When they got back to the palace, there was a 3-course luncheon for 70 in the state dining room, and they cut their silver wedding cake, and it was topped by a silver bowl filled with gardenias and white roses. In the afternoon, they made an appearance on the balcony, and when it was dark, they made a few more appearances under the floodlights. In between those balcony appearances, they rode in an open car for 22 miles, mainly in the east and south London, and everyone was enthusiastic. Flags and bunting decorated almost every house, and the people on the East End remembered how the King and Queen came to see them when they were bombed. When they got back to the palace, they delivered back-to-back radio broadcasts. The King said, according to the book George VI and Elizabeth, it had been a memorable and a very happy day, and he gave thanks for their supremely happy married life. He recalled the periods of difficulty, of anxiety and sorrow they shared, and he said it would have been almost too heavy a burden but for the strength and comfort which I always found in my home. And the Queen, she gave a brief speech too. She expressed her gratitude for the opportunity to serve their beloved country and for the blessings of our home and children. Queen Elizabeth said, "Married lives are in a sense communities in miniature, in some way the highest form of human fellowship." And later, George VI wrote to his mother saying, "We were both dumbfounded over our reception. It does spur us on to further efforts." It was in the beginning of 1948 in the spring that the King began to have health issues. He got pains in his legs, and his feet at times felt cold and numb. The King started to record his sensations in the early January. By the summer, he was walking in the hills in Edinburgh with his aide Peter Townsend. The aide stated the King would usually walk with a steady long stride, and that evening he had trouble and kept saying, "What's the matter with my blasted legs? They won't work properly." In the fall of the year, his feet were numb often, and he had trouble sleeping. The first doctor he saw was a physical therapist, and he had helped George V when he was having painful shoulder pains. The doctor didn't try to find the source of the problem. Instead, he worked on relieving the symptoms. The King carried on as usual, and he participated in the state opening of the Parliament and entertained the Queen of Denmark. And the Queen wrote to Secretary Tommy Lascelles asking him for help in getting the King's leg treated. The doctor he had seen said the doctor needed bed rest, and he placed the King's legs in clamps for 8 hours a day to improve the flow of blood. The doctor felt he needed help to doctor the King, and he brought in a more medical specialist, and that included a cardiologist and a vascular surgeon. November the 12th, the King was told he had arteriosclerosis, which was a hardening of the arteries that had caused the blood to flow less in his legs and feet. It was aggravated by smoking. So George VI had a 2-pack-a-day habit, and he sometimes smoked 50 cigarettes in one day. So this concerned the Queen and the Princess Elizabeth, and they didn't smoke. So Edward VI and George V, and they had died young from tobacco-related respiratory illnesses, and Lilibet asked Philip to quit smoking on their wedding day, and he did. George VI didn't give up his nicotine habit, but he followed the doctor's orders when they said that his bad circulation could cause gangrene and might result in amputation of his right leg. The King continued to work, but he was confined to his bed for 2 months with the clamps on his legs, so this made him understandably a little bit cranky. Now we have the birth of Prince Charles. The King got out of his bed November the 14th, 1948, to celebrate the birth of his first grandchild, Prince Charles. After viewing their grandchild, they celebrated with champagne in the equerry's room with Queen Mary and members of the royal household. Elizabeth was said to be beaming with happiness, and the King was simply delighted by the success of everything. Well, the King and Queen were supposed to go to Australia and New Zealand with Princess Margaret, but it was canceled because of the circulation problem in the King's legs, and the journey was too long for him to make the trip. And he wasn't allowed to go anywhere nearby either. When the doctors examined him December the 12th, they said he needed to be confined to his bed for another 3 weeks, and if he moved, it could cause a setback. So the family celebrated Christmas at Buckingham Palace instead of Sandringham. The king, following the doctor's orders, was able to avoid amputation, but he complained to his mother that he was tired and bored with bed. The end of 1948 had Queen Elizabeth feeling better about Bertie, thinking he would be able to take up his life again. The Queen agreed with the doctors that overwork and strain and mental worry had contributed to his condition. She probably knew smoking had been the primary cause, but she didn't say it. Early in 1949, the king was able to travel to Sandringham to shoot rabbits in the mornings, and in the afternoon he rested and used leg clamps for 4 hours. In March, they said that his only chance for a normal life would be to do a procedure called right lumbar sympathectomy. The king was angry and said, "So our treatment has been a waste of time," but it wasn't, because the king rested up to prepare for the surgery. March the 12th, 1949, the operation was performed in a surgical suite in the Bull Room at Buckingham Palace. The doctor had to cut the nerves at the base of the king's spine that had been contracting the arteries in his right leg. By eliminating them, it would allow more blood to reach his feet. This wouldn't cure his hardening of the arteries. The disease risked a clot or thrombosis, which could stop the flow of blood to the king's heart. The operation helped King George VI feel better, and he carried out limited number of engagements. The king and the queen, they enjoyed being grandparents. Princess Elizabeth and Philip had royal duties that took them away, so the king and queen looked after Charles and Anne for extended periods from late 1949 to the mid-1951. The queen kept Lilibet informed of the kids, from teething to baby Anne's cooing and the short vulgar laughs to Charles being fascinated by snowflakes. And this is the time when the bond developed between Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles. The king said that the grandkids were a welcome distraction from troubling world developments, and he said, "They cheer us up more than I can say." Margaret Crawford, she had been a governess, and she retired in early 1949, and she got a cottage house called Nottingham Cottage near Kensington Palace and a generous pension. Crawford decided to write a memoir of her 15 years with the royal family, and that didn't set well with Queen Elizabeth. She said, "Those in positions of confidence with us must be utterly oyster." Crawford was not formal in her writing, and it was kind of chatty, and she didn't want to submit to royal control. She worked with Ladies' Home Journal editor Beatrice Gold, and Beatrice Gold was a lady that had offended the royals when they made a royal visit to America during a visit to see Eleanor Roosevelt. Crawford insisted on doing her memoirs on her own terms and under her own name. The queen felt betrayed because she was writing a book without the royal approval. She didn't like that Crawford had said that the queen was lax about her daughter's education, and the palace in the end got to change 13 offensive passages. The book, entitled Little Princesses, became a bestseller. The royal family hated the book and cut off contact with Crawford, a woman they once considered their true and trustworthy friend. The king gets worse. George VI, from 1949 onwards, had more uncertain health than the public realized. Even those close to him found it easier to deceive themselves than to admit the king's condition. In 1950, author Patrick Lee Fermer told Harold Nicholson that while George VI was charming, he was heavily made up with suntan and rouge. In the spring of 1951, the king's condition couldn't be hidden. He had to cut back on public engagements on the orders of his doctors. In May, the king and queen opened the Festival of Britain, which was a tribute to the centenary of Prince Albert's Great Exhibition of 1851, and an attempt to showcase Britain's post-war comeback. May 24th, the king attended a special ceremony at Westminster Abbey, installing his brother Prince Henry as Grand Master of the Order of Bath, and he was running a fever at this time, and there were many that day that said the king looked ill. And when Bertie went to bed that night, he felt like he had the flu. He wrote his mother in June that after getting penicillin injections, he said, "I feel now that I have got the chance of a rest and had much better take and get really well." He canceled his engagement for 6 weeks. The king tried all summer to chuck out the bug, as he would like to say, even though he had extended periods of recuperation at Royal Lodge in Sandringham. Lilibet and Philip left Malta when they realized that her father couldn't fulfill his public duties, and once back, Lilibet started to do his duties for him. The Queen and the Princess Margaret also began to fill in for the king on occasions. And in early August, George VI and Elizabeth went to Balmoral. The king had a successful shooting with Philip and other house guests. When the weather started to turn cold and rainy, George VI went out on the hill. He moved slowly and coughed and ended up with a chill and a sore throat. Princess Margaret, she celebrated her 21st birthday at Balmoral on August the 21st, 1951, with a group of aristocratic young men and women. After dinner, they went outdoors and lit torches and danced and had pipers playing. Princess Margaret had a blast, but her father in his room wasn't too happy with all the noise going on. He asked his equerry, "Won't those bloody people ever go to bed?" 10 days later, Elizabeth summoned the doctors and they did some x-rays, and the x-ray showed a tumor in the left lung. So Bertie had to go to London for an exploratory bronchoscopy and biopsy of the left lung. The results confirmed what the doctors had suspected. Bertie had a malignant tumor, and the doctors didn't tell the king or his family. In those times, it was normal for the doctors to do that because cancer held a stigma. The reason for it was the heavy cigarette smoking. September 21st, a medical bulletin stated that George VI needed his left lung removed due to what they would call structural changes, instead of saying the word cancer. The king said, "If it's going to help me to get well again, I don't mind, but the very idea of the surgeon's knife again is hell." The king told this to a friend. Queen Elizabeth had a positive attitude, and she wrote to her mother, "He is so wonderfully brave about it all, and it does seem hard that he should have to go through so much. But if only this operation is successful, it may help him to regain a certain amount of health." September the 23rd, he had the operation. 1 doctor did the surgery, and 4 more doctors were in attendance. The operation began at 10 a.m. and lasted 3 hours. The physicians saw a malignancy in the right lung, and they thought the king was unlikely to live more than 2 years, but they kept those thoughts to themselves. Elizabeth reported to the Queen Mary the operation had been successful, and the king later told Queen Mary that thank goodness there were no complications. October the 5th, Elizabeth wrote her sister May that Bertie was making steady progress. He was still in pain, but could move a little in bed, propped up with pillows. Tommy Lascelles suggested that the Queen, the princesses, Prince Henry, and the Princess Mary be appointed as council of the state to deal with day-to-day matters. Queen Elizabeth was asked to see the Duke of Windsor, who was in London, but Queen Elizabeth refused. She felt that he was part of the reason why the king had all his troubles. Everyone that was around the king falsely believed that the king would be back to normal because of the surgery. When he first got out of bed, he raised his arms above his shoulders numerous times, as if he had a shotgun in his hands, and he showed a twinkle of merriment about getting back to hunting again. He was determined to get well, just as he had been determined to get over his stutter years ago. Bertie would walk the grounds, and on November 30th, he told his friend and speech therapist Lionel Logue that his recovery had been helped by the right breathing techniques he had learned from him. He had no trouble walking upstairs, and there was no extra exertion. His voice, though, was quite another matter. The surgical and bronchoscopy procedures had damaged his vocal cords. He said his voice was getting stronger all the time, but is husky. At this time, Bertie was still unable to carry out routine public duties because it tired him out too much. The Christmas broadcast, written with the help of Elizabeth, he didn't have the stamina for the live broadcast, so he worked with BBC sound engineer Robert Wood to record his remarks in mid-December. The king would say a few words before pausing to rest. It took a very long time, at least 2 hours, before the few hundred words were actually completed. Wood said it was very, very distressing for him and the Queen and for me, because I admired him so much and I wished I could do more to help. And the family, they had a happy Christmas holiday at Sandringham. Princess Margaret felt that her father was in the best of health, having triumphantly recovered from an appalling operation. The king was in high spirits, not having the anxiety about having to deliver a live speech. On Boxing Day, the king started to shoot with a light gun. The following morning, he was out with a family group that included the Duke of Edinburgh and the Duke of Gloucester. His neighbor, Maurice Roach, said that he shot with the king the other day. He wrote a friend saying, "I thought he was very well, but he looked tired. He smokes a lot, too. I'm surprised the doctor allows that with only 1 lung." February the 3rd, the king seemed to be recovering, and he wrote a letter to his doctor and thanked him for prescribing his various remedies. He ended the letter by saying, "With the doctor's generous help, I shall get back my health to normal." George went out 2 days later, and the weather was beautiful, blue skies and bright sunshine. He went out with tenants, friends, local farmers, estate workers, policemen, and a staff for an informal day shooting hares, rabbits, and pigeons. Maurice Fernoy joined the king in the woods and the fields that morning. He said it was a perfect day for shooting. The king was in great form. And when they all got together to eat lunch, the king didn't complain of being tired or ill. The last hunt of the day, George VI got 9 hares, 3 of them with his final 3 shots. Later that evening, the king, the queen, and Princess Margaret had a joyous dinner. Princess Margaret played the piano, and they all listened to the radio for the news of Lilibet and Philip's trip to Africa. The king retired to his bedroom at 10:30 p.m. and asked his servant to bring him some hot cocoa. He was reading a hunting magazine and said goodnight cheerfully. The watchman in the garden saw the king come to the window at midnight, and he fiddled with the latch. The next morning at 7:30 a.m., February the 6th, 1952, the king's valet, James MacDonald, brought the king his cup of tea. It was then that he found him motionless in his bed. He was 56 and had died that night of coronary thrombosis, the blood clot that had been shadowing him for 3 years. Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary that she flew into his room and thought he was in a deep sleep. He looked so peaceful, and I realized what happened. Princess Elizabeth was now going to be queen, and she was to be notified. The message was sent to Nairobi, but the telegraph operator didn't have access to the code book, so he couldn't decipher the code Hyde Park Corner, which was the signal for the king's death. Lilibet's private secretary, Martin Charteris, heard the news from a journalist who caught a bulletin from Reuters wire service in London. Prince Philip told Elizabeth the news. Even with the years of the king being ill, it was a shock when he died. Elizabeth told Queen Mary that the night before he was in wonderful form and looking so well. Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary, "He was my whole life. One can only be deeply thankful for the utterly happy years we had together." She also told Queen Mary how devoted Bertie had been to his mother. "I do feel for you so, darling Mama. Bertie's so young still and so precious." Queen Mary wrote to Elizabeth, "The great affection between your darling Bertie and us all. You have been such a wonderful wife to him in well and woe, and such a prop when things were a little difficult and he was upset." Queen Mary, she was worried about Lilibet taking the throne when she was so young, but she said she knew her steadfast character would carry her through, and she would be greatly helped by dear Philip. And Winston Churchill made a broadcast the night after Bertie died. He noticed in the last few months that the king walked with death as if death were a companion, an acquaintance whom he recognized and did not fear. And when he was home, within the family he cherished, he could look round day by day and feel warmth and encouragement from the steady radiance of his own darling angel, Elizabeth. Winston wrote to the Queen Mother that Your Majesty's devotion and love made it possible for him to reach the pinnacle on which he stood at his death. But then there is the future. Boundless hopes are centered in your daughter's gleaming personality and reign. Winston was right. Queen Elizabeth was the future for the country, and she continued where her father, King George VI, and her mother, Queen Elizabeth, left off. Their team efforts did save the British monarchy. I hope that you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. The king never gave up on trying to be healthy again, and the days before his death, it appeared he had done that. I'm glad he had the happy final days he had, and that he peacefully passed away. He deserved to go out that way. I wish everyone a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.